Thank you very much for inviting us to speak here today at the University of Sussex. We're delighted to participate in this Holocaust memorial event. So the story you're going to hear this afternoon relates to my mother's family, the Kanareks. My grandmother, Rosie Gutmann, was born in Poland in 1905. Her family moved to Switzerland when she was a young girl. My grandfather, Zygmunt Kanarek, was born in 1904 in Poland, and he grew up in Germany from the age of 4. Rosie and Zygmunt met in 1932 and married later that year in Frankfurt, Germany. Rosie and Zygmunt had 2 children, my mother Zahava and Yehudi. Now during this talk you're going to see a collection of photographs and images of documents and letters. These were collected and kept by my grandmother before and throughout the war at enormous personal risk. Had she been caught with them, she would have been killed. Even after the war, Rosie never spoke about her ordeal or these documents. It was only when she died in 2001, that's nearly 14 years ago, that my mother discovered a tiny little suitcase at the back of a cupboard containing these documents. So let me set the scene for you. From 1933, as you probably know, Germany was becoming increasingly anti-Semitic under the rule of the Nazis. And the laws that were passed were progressively more restrictive to Jews. My grandparents were amongst the 33,000 Jews who chose to leave Germany for Palestine. Whilst waiting for their papers, they lived in Amsterdam. They emigrated to Palestine in 1935, and at that time, Palestine was under British control. My mother was born in Palestine in August 1935. My grandparents found the move from Germany to Palestine extremely difficult in terms of adjusting to the climate and also having to find work. In fact, my grandmother's health suffered so much during this time that the doctors advised her to return to Europe. They left Palestine in April 1937 and they returned to Amsterdam. Of course, they would have no idea of the enormous impact this decision would have on their lives, or the irony of the fact that they returned to Europe for health reasons. So here we have a photograph from 1937 or beginning 1938, and you have my mother and her parents. At this stage, back in Amsterdam, they lived a relatively ordinary life. And I'm going to ask my mother to tell you a little bit about this period in Amsterdam in the late 1930s.
Well, we lived in a Jewish area in the center of Amsterdam, and still at the time relatively a normal kind of life. We lived in a block of flats, 3 floors in the Jewish area, and on the top floor was a lady, Lise de Betuwe.
That's later. Just talk about the school at this stage.
About?
Just general life, your father's
No,
work.
my father had his job. He worked for a rainwear company, and that was still a relatively normal life. I had regularly friends who came to play with me in the afternoon, and then I went to kindergarten, and because that was still when things were as normal as one could expect. And that was from the age of about 4. And afterwards, at the age in Holland, you start school a bit later. So at the age of 6, I went to the primary school, again a Jewish school, and which was very close by where we lived.
So as my mother said, from the age of 4, she attended a Jewish nursery school in Amsterdam. And here we have a little photograph of all these kids in their Dutch costume, and that is my mother over there. From nursery school, she went on to a Jewish primary school. And here's my mother in the top row. On the 10th of May 1940, Holland was invaded by Germany. My mother was nearly 5 years old at the time. And from then on, conditions became increasingly difficult for Dutch Jews, and they had to adapt to the increasing pressures of being a Jew under Nazi occupation. By April 1942, the Nazis had ordered that all Dutch Jews had to wear the yellow Star of David on all their outer clothing, including their children. And we can see it from the school photograph over here. And my mother is actually in her hand holding one of the original stars that she had from all those years ago. And you're probably more familiar with the German word Jude for Jew, but this is the Dutch word Jood, J-O-O-D. And as you're probably familiar, or maybe not, every single outer garment had to have a yellow Star of David tightly stitched. Every single corner had to be tightly stitched onto that garment. And once again, we have a photograph here of my mother wearing a star on her outer clothes. In August 1941, Zahava's brother Yehudi was born. My mother was 6 years old at the time. And here we have a lovely family photograph taken at that time, and a photograph of my mother with her brother. My grandparents were desperate to leave Holland, and they were investigating ways to do so. But they also faced many obstacles. Travel within Holland was severely restricted. There were curfews at night, and in addition, they were no longer allowed to use any form of public transportation. So, the only way to escape would be to be smuggled out under the cover of night. But this really wasn't an option at this time, because with a newborn baby, it was going to be extremely difficult, because no doubt he would have cried and given the game away. So that was no option. So in December 1942, when Yehudi was just 16 months old, my grandparents took a very painful and tough decision. They decided to hand their little baby boy to the Dutch resistance to try to ensure his safety. Given his Aryan features, blue eyes and blonde hair, they believed he was more likely to survive the war if he was separated from the family and hidden. This must have been a devastating moment for my grandparents, the necessity to choose between two unbearable options. And as a mother, I can't even begin to think what it must have been like to be faced with that decision. My grandmother was told she was to give Yehudi away on two conditions. She was not allowed to know where he was being sent because it was going to endanger those, of course, who were going to look after him. And she was not allowed to stand near the window or draw any attention to what was happening when he was taken away. Over 70 years on, my mother still vividly recalls her mother sobbing when Yehudi was taken away. My grandparents were still trying to do all they could to escape from Holland. They even tried to get papers for Honduras citizenship, which they bought and received in April 1943. They'd bought these at enormous financial cost. My mother has that original document in her hand, and she's going to talk about that in a few moments. Unfortunately, the paper arrived too late and they couldn't be used, and that was a huge blow for the Canarecs at this stage. Fate was now closing in on Zahava's family. By then, the Germans were deporting Jews en masse to extermination and concentration camps all around Europe. On the 26th of May, 1943, the SS came for my mother and her parents. Now, at this time, my mother had a very bad case of chickenpox, and the SS were famously neurotic about the possibility about being contaminated by any form of infectious disease, which of course chickenpox was. So my grandparents hoped that because the chickenpox was severe, it might in fact defer their deportation. But that's not what happened. What the SS wanted to do when they came in was they wanted to put my mother on a sick transport and put her parents on a different transport. When my mother heard this, she started screaming hysterically that they could not be separated. My mother will now tell you about this incident when the SS came for them on that particular day.
Well, just the sheer thought that I was going to be separated from my parents, I couldn't face. And as Hephzibah said, I screamed so hysterically because what would have happened, the SS would have taken my parents on one transport and me, what they called the sick transport, and we would never have seen each other again. But being so hysterical as I was on that particular occasion, they gave in and they let us travel together. And that really saved us.
Do you want to elaborate why it was so important you stuck together?
Because first of all, I, being born in Palestine, I was British protected because under British mandate. And that was one of the main reasons, actually, that we had afterwards also, as we mentioned before, the Honduras paper came too late, but just me being British protected would have been one way of getting us together and saved.
Because it meant that my grandparents were able to stay with my mother, who was a minor, and so that was hugely significant at that time. And also you were upset because, of course, your brother had been taken at this stage, so another thought of being separated was actually too much.
And for my parents, it must have been terrible, to having already given one child away into hiding and then having to go to be separated from the other child. That was something they just couldn't face.
So, at this moment in time, they were allowed to travel together. My mother and her parents were sent to Westerbork in northeast Holland. From 1942 to 1944, Westerbork served as a transit camp for Jews who were being deported from the Netherlands to Eastern Europe. A total of almost 100,000 Jews were deported from Westerbork, with the bulk going on to Auschwitz and Sobibor, as well as Theresienstadt and Bergen-Belsen. Now, my grandparents had anticipated that something like this was going to happen at some stage, and they had asked somebody in Amsterdam to inform Zahava's grandparents who lived in Switzerland if this ever were to happen. So in June 1943, Zahava's grandparents received a postcard from someone who had signed it as El Shochen, and in a moment, after I read this excerpt, my mother will explain the significance of this card. It's dated the 27th of May 1943, and it reads as follows. Dear Gutmann family, your postcard of the 17th of May has not reached your children. Unfortunately, they were taken away yesterday, on the 26th of May, 1943. That means Rosie, Zygmunt, and Zahava. Should I hear anything about them, I will let you know immediately. Yehudi is in good health. In the circumstances, he is all right. In the name of your loved ones, warmest regards, El Shochen. Now, my mother is not familiar with anyone of that name, but she will tell you who wrote the card and why the card was written in that way.
Well, as I mentioned before, this lady, Lies de Betuwe, lived on the top floor of the same block of flats as we did. And very often, when my mother had to go to do some shopping or so, she would leave me with her in her flat, and that I was allowed to help her to sort out buttons or whatever. Being a seamstress, she gave me always little jobs to keep me occupied. And on that particular occasion,
with the card, the code, the card, to find it.
And as she lived together, which of course I didn't know at that time, with a gentleman, Leo Fuchs, and he spoke fluent Hebrew, and he must have given her the name to send to my grandparents, El Shochen, Shochen meaning neighbor, and that my grandparents would know who had written the card.
So as you can see, it's a coded card, so the grandparents in Zurich at this time knew they'd been taken away, and it was this non-Jewish lady who had written that card. During their time in Westerbork, my grandparents were working each day. And from the cards that Rosie managed to keep, we can see that her work included sorting scrap metal and sorting out beans and pulses. My grandfather was a food distributor and a collector at this time. The children in the camp stayed together during the days when the parents were working. We've got a couple of cards with us today. That's just the first one you can see refers to one of my grandfather's working cards. And this refers to one of my grandmother's working cards. And as you can see, you have the date, very often the hour, and the duty she had to perform every single day. Every single document was meticulously documented with every single detail. So we have a number of these remarkable work cards still today. Some letters did reach Zahava's parents through the postal system in Westerbork. Remember, this was a transit camp, and there still was a postal system here. And these letters give us an insight into what was going on still outside the camp. And we know that some of the Kanarik's non-Jewish friends were still trying to help them, sending things into the camp at this stage. They were sometimes trying to send in food, if that was possible. It was very hard to do that, but they were still trying to do so. And we also have a letter from a gentleman called Mr. Yelles, who was my grandfather's a neighbor, And on one occasion, he writes in to say that he's trying to send in him a few grapes and also a tiny little comb for my mother, because it was a lice comb, and lice was hugely widespread in all of these camps. We also know my mother actually had contracted meningitis while she was in Westerbork. And we know there were many Jewish doctors who had been sent to Westerbork, but we're not exactly sure what access to medication they had at this time. Now, whilst they were in Westerbork, on another occasion, my grandmother received a different letter dated the 30th of September 1943, which is very significant. It's from Annie Rodenberg, and Annie Rodenberg is their contact with the Dutch resistance. And in this letter, which I'm going to read to you, you'll hear what she's saying, and it goes as follows. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Kanarek, after a long silence, I can write to you again. All is well with the nurse and her children. I visited them last week. The youngest is becoming a real boy now, big and really tall, much more of a boy. You may remember he was just like a little girl with all those curls. That's all, just keep well. Best regards, Annie Rodenberg. So it's a coded card once again. There's been no mention of Yehudi, but of course they're talking about Yehudi. He's alive still at this stage, September 1943. He's had his hair cut off and now looks much more of a boy. So everything you've seen so far, there's no names being mentioned whatsoever. So of course my grandparents are being reassured that he's alive at this station. There was a transport from Westerbork to the extermination camps every Tuesday, and the lists were put up on a Monday night. 4 months after they arrived at Westerbork, on a Monday night, my mother and her parents were informed that they were on the list of those being sent to Auschwitz on the transport the following morning. The next morning, they gathered at the train station. The platform was crowded with people, including SS soldiers and vicious barking dogs. There's a sense of fear and despair amongst everyone. They had a strong idea what lay ahead. And just as the Kanareks were about to climb into one of those cattle carts, at the very last moment, their names were called and they were told not to get on that train. My mother will tell you what happened on that platform at Westerbork and perhaps the night before.
Well, the SS woman in Westerbork had given my parents a few interviews because they were told that they were not going to be sent, me being born in Palestine. And then we had, of course, the other thing that was going to save us. We had those papers for Honduras. And what we never could understand even later, she had the original paper in her hands, and there was one photo of my father, one of my mother, and one of my brother and me together. And she never asked what had happened to the other child, because my parents told me if I were to be asked by the SS woman what had happened to my brother, I had to tell her that we had lost him on the way from Amsterdam to Westerbork, and we had no idea because I was a very young child and my parents were very worried that I might give certain things away. So they kept on repeating again and again, whoever was going to ask me what had happened to my little brother, I had to tell them we had lost him on the way. And literally, had this chap come a few seconds later, we would have been in the cattle cart and nobody would have known where we were. And so it was, he just came up when people said, this is family Kanarek. So the chap came up to my parents and said, I wish I had this message for more people as I have got for you. You've been taken off this transport. Had he come literally a minute later, we would have been inside the cattle cart and nobody would have known where we were. And I can also remember actually the night before, because I had seen these transports every Tuesday leaving, and when we were going to go on the transport on that particular Tuesday, there were always 2 or 3 normal carriages with windows for the SS. And I said to my parents, can we please go very early the next morning that we get a proper seat with a window? Because the sheer thought of having to go into a cattle cart, I just couldn't face. I was suffering slightly from asthma, and the sheer thought of being inside a cattle cart was something. something I just couldn't even think of. So my parents had to explain to me that that was not going to be possible, that we had to go wherever we were going to be directed.
We don't know the exact reason why they were taken off that particular train, but perhaps the Germans wanted to use my mother to barter with the enemy. It's hard not to overstate this, but simply, had this man, this guard, come literally 1 minute later, my mother and her parents would have been in one of those cattle carts, the doors would have been shut, and nobody would ever have been able to find them, and we'll not be telling you the story today. So they were spared deportation at this moment in time. They stayed on in Westerbork for a further 5 months in these dreadful conditions. On one occasion, my grandmother received a bag of raw beans through the post. She was puzzled. Why would a stranger send her a bag of raw beans? There were no cooking facilities at Westerbork, and she just couldn't understand why this had happened. And even though she knew she couldn't use those raw beans, one night she found herself sifting through that little bag of beans, and there, hidden among the beans, this is what she found. She discovered a tiny photograph of her son, Yehudi. And my mother is holding the original photograph that was smuggled into Westerbork by the Dutch resistance. It's extraordinary on many levels. First of all, it's extraordinary that that little package actually arrived and reached my grandmother, that it wasn't intercepted. It's extraordinary that the Dutch resistance were taking those risks to actually send things into Westerbork at that stage. And also that my grandmother thought, well, why is someone sending me those beans? What is the significance of this? And that she found that particular photograph. Yehudi, of course, is the child right in the very front. And for my grandmother, this was absolutely a huge thing. She knew he was alive at this stage, and for her it became a major signal of hope for her to try and live to see her son still again. The people looking after her had just managed to get this into her. It makes us also wonder how many other things had been smuggled into the camps, and perhaps how many things, of course, never reached my grandparents. The next thing I'd like to show you, which I find quite powerful, is this. It's a Jewish New Year card that my mother made and gave to her parents in Westerbork in September 1943. The remarkable thing to me is that in this horrible, oppressive camp, the inmates were still trying to keep their faith and tradition alive. My mother's actually holding in her hand the original card that she made in September 1943 for her parents. It's on the back of a scrap of a piece of cardboard, and it's beautiful handwriting, which is also remarkable because my mother had barely been to school at this stage. She was now 8 years old, but as she mentioned before, you only start school very late in Amsterdam, and she'd of course had no schooling. She was now in Westerbork. And for those who may not realize this or know, here we have the various symbols of the Jewish New Year. We have the ram's horn, we have the pot of honey to signify a sweet year, the Star of David, and an apple. And a translation, this is in Dutch, a translation of what my mother's saying in this card goes as follows. Dear parents, I hope that next year we will be in better circumstances. In the meantime, Shana Tova, Happy New Year, and may you be inscribed in the Book of Life. Well, it appears my mother was somewhat over-optimistic, because just 4 months later, in January 1944, my mother and my grandparents were selected to go to Bergen-Belsen, a concentration camp near Hanover in northwest Germany. While Bergen-Belsen contained no gas chambers, more than 35,000 people died of starvation, overwork, disease, brutality, and as a result of sadistic medical experiments. By April 1945, more than 60,000 prisoners were incarcerated in Belsen's 2 neighboring camps, originally designed to hold 10,000. I've just put this map in here just to contextualize where the various camps are, and also there's a key. As you can see, the white skulls are the concentration camps, and the black skulls are the extermination camps. And Bergen-Belsen is up here. And you're maybe familiar with other camps, so I'll just sort of pinpoint them here. You have Auschwitz over here, and we have Dachau at the bottom there. But this is where my mother and my grandparents were in Bergen-Belsen. Whilst they were in Bergen-Belsen, my grandmother worked as a cleaner for the SS commandant. And sometimes it would give her the chance to find the odd cigarette butt, which would now try and trade for a crust of bread. Every scrap of food made the difference. This was a starvation camp. My grandfather worked in the shoe commando, where inmates salvaged pieces of leather from shoes belonging to inmates who had died. It was filthy work, and the conditions were grueling. In Bergen-Belsen, my grandfather suffered at the brutal hands of the SS. All of his teeth were knocked out, and we have no idea the reason for it, and he never spoke about it. There were countless other incidents of cruelty and physical brutality meted out by the SS. So what was it like in Bergen-Belsen? Well, Bergen-Belsen comprised several wooden barracks, poorly built and just overflowing with people. The wind blew through the feeble structures throughout those freezing winters. The roofs leaked, making the floors wet and cold. The beds were mere planks of wood, arranged in endless rows of 3 bunks. There were 2 or more people on each narrow plank of wood. There was no bedding. My mother and my grandmother shared a top bunk. Sanitation was almost non-existent. There were hardly any toilets or washing facilities for the tens of thousands of prisoners. The few toilets that existed were outside, and they were pretty much useless during those freezing winters because they were actually frozen. Instead, most inmates used tin pots in the barracks, which meant there was a constant stench of excrement. Disease was rampant, mainly in the form of typhus and dysentery, both of which were hugely contagious. The chronic overcrowding ensured that these epidemics spread at a fearsome speed. There was no medical treatment for the sick, and thousands of people of all ages died from these diseases. Now, my mother has many recollections, of course, what happened in those barracks, but there's one particular one that she remembers referring to these conditions, and she's going to speak about that one particular incident.
Well, next, on the other side of the beam was a lady who was very ill with typhus. And she could even not, though there were no proper facilities in any case, but she couldn't even try to go to a toilet. She was too weak to get up because she was also on the 3rd bunk. So she had put one of those tin pots on the beam which separated her and our bunk. And during the night, she had to use the pot, the tin pot, and as she was so weak, she couldn't control herself and knocked it over, and it came all over me. And you'll see later on, I had very long plaits. So my mother was terribly worried, as she was so ill with typhus, that I was going to get the disease as well. So the next morning, at about 5 o'clock, because they usually used to come at about 6 in the morning, to bring some colored fluid, which they called coffee. So my mother queued up at 5 o'clock in the morning that she would get a bit more than the usual amount of fluid, that she would be able to get it out of my hair, because otherwise she thought they were going to have to shave my hair off. And
but remarkably, my mother did not contract typhus at that stage. The main focus of each day was the early morning roll call, otherwise known as the appel, and this took place outside early in the morning in all weather conditions, the snow, the rain, and the oppressive summer heat. It lasted for hours each morning, and during this time the prisoners had to stand to attention, and they were forbidden to move or to talk. In the winter, the inmates had to stand in the freezing cold, often knee-deep in snow, wearing the lightest of clothes and shoes, if they were lucky. My mother, by then aged 9, had grown taller even despite these conditions, and she had grown out of the shoes and the clothes she had arrived with. It meant she went largely barefoot. Many inmates fell down during roll call and were often killed because they were regarded too weak to work. My mother has also told me of the games the Nazis would play for their amusement during the roll call. They would start counting everyone, and then suddenly in the middle they would pretend to lose count, and they would start the roll call all over again, just to create more humiliation for the inmates. Humiliation and degradation were the key elements for the SS rule in the camps, and the SS officers regularly employed torture and punishment to maintain tight control amongst the prisoners. My mother also recalls the watchtowers with searchlights and the constant barking of dogs and the sound of gunfire. And to this day, she's uncomfortable around large dogs, and she hates the sound of fireworks because they remind her of her time in Bergen-Belsen. There was hardly anything to eat or to drink. In the morning, as my mother said before, they were given a watery coffee substitute, and they were given one crust of bread. This crust of bread was the only solid food an inmate received each day. It had to last the entire day. In the evening, they were then given a watery soup made from turnips in water, served in these bowls. And these are the bowls that we have from my mother and my grandparents from Bergen-Belsen. The food had no taste and no nutritional value. Many went mad with hunger, and tens of thousands died from starvation. This was a starvation camp. The average life expectancy of an inmate could be measured in weeks. It's remarkable how the Canoreks had survived for this long. They were simply left to starve. The men's barracks were separate, and it was only on rare occasions that Rosie was able to see her husband. Now, whilst the Canoreks were in Bergen-Belsen, my grandmother was forced by the SS to write to her parents in Switzerland. And in each card, my grandmother is made to write to them to say that they are healthy and well. And we have these remarkable letters. We have them here today, so if you want to have a look at them at first hand later, I'm going to talk you through a couple of them now. So here's the first one I'm referring to. We have the Gutmann family, which is my mother's grandparents in Switzerland. It's their address. You have Rosie Canorek's name here and the block she's in. You have the Bergen-Belsen postmark and Berlin postmark here. And the next one is basically a totally prescribed card. Every single one of these cards pretty much says the same. And it says words the following: "My dear parents, how are you? We are well. We hope you are well. Please send us food. We are allowed to receive food parcels. In the name of your loved ones." And then it goes Rosie, Zygmunt, and Zahava. So we have, that's the first one we have here, we're showing you today. And my mother's holding these two in her hand. These are the original cards that we have. They are extraordinary. I will tell you later about them, how we have them. And before you say that, I'll just tell you that the other thing that the SS made my grandmother do is when she was writing to her parents in Switzerland, she was also writing, "Please do not send anything registered," because of course we know that when you send things registered, you have to sign things. So the SS were of course intercepting every single one of these packages that were being sent into the camps by my mother's grandparents.
Well, we have got two different cards, because both in the handwriting of my mother, but one of them in a different name as the other, because one card she was dictated to send in her name, and then the SS wanted to get another parcel of food, so she had to give somebody else's name. But everything is in the same handwriting, my mother's handwriting, written to her parents that they should get food parcels.
And the chilling side, of course, to this is that we have the other side of the story, where we have Zahava's grandparents writing to them to Bergen-Belsen. And we have one card I'm going to read to you now, which is dated the 16th of October 1944. And they've already been in Bergen-Belsen now for 10 months. And this is what the grandparents write. "My dear children, today we received the second postcard from you. We are very happy to hear that you are well. We are also well. We have sent you many parcels, and please God you should receive them all. Our good wishes and kisses, Mama." How far from the truth. Now, we have these cards, and I wonder very often where we think these cards are being kept by your mother in barracks. I mean, maybe you can just give us a bit of an idea of the sense of what the living conditions were like in that particular barrack.
Well, we had nothing. There were just the three bunks, one on top of the other, and nothing else. So I have got no, and I was too young, and my mother didn't speak to me about these things because she didn't want me to have to worry about things like that. And I've got no idea where she would be able to have kept all these things. She must have kept it in that small bag, which she kept on our bunk, and which I only found after she passed away. But there was never any talk about anything like this, because my mother didn't want to impose all these things that I had to worry about.
My grandmother also managed to keep some scraps of paper which permitted her to be excused occasionally from work when she or when my mother was so ill. And these are little fragments of papers that my grandmother managed to keep. And they were just like random little pieces of paper which sometimes permitted her to be off work on certain days. And we have them with us. And there are also occasions that interestingly, my grandfather could be excused from it. By the end of December 1944, he was suffering terribly from frostbite and exhaustion. And that gives him one day off from work. We have no idea why, but he was given the day off work. And this is one of the cards relating to my mother's very poor health at that stage. So many people were killed when they were deemed too weak to work. I can't explain why this family, thankfully, were not killed for the same reason. By the early months of 1945, Germany had lost the war and was descending into chaos. The entire population of Bergen-Belsen was literally starving, and the inmates were just left to die. On the 20th of January 1945, that's pretty much 70 years ago to the day, exactly that was last week, 70 years ago to the day, the Canareks were told they were being removed from Bergen-Belsen. It's not entirely clear if the family was being exchanged for money or political prisoners or both, but it is likely the Nazis received something in return for the Canareks' release. It's unlikely the Canareks would have survived for many more days under these horrendous conditions. This was also the height of the typhus epidemic at Bergen-Belsen. It's extraordinary that they managed to survive and emerge from that living hell. My mother was so weak she could actually barely walk out of the camp. And I'm going to ask her to tell you a little bit about the day when she was told they were being released. What happened when you were told you were being released from the camp with your mom and the barrack leader?
Well, when my parents were informed that we were going to go on the next day to be exchanged, which, as we just said, might have been either for food or for other reasons, my parents, I was so weak and so ill that my parents said to the barrack leader that they thought I wasn't going to be able to make the journey. And so the barrack leader said to, well, she was Jewish, of course, and she said to my parents, don't say anything, but just push her through this control, otherwise you won't have a chance, because she knew how ill I was, and she was worried that I wasn't going to make it. So she told my parents, don't say anything anymore, just push her through, and otherwise that will be it. And I've got a very clear vision of that, funnily enough, still, because I remember these were normal, that was a normal Red Cross train with carriages and so forth. And when we got then onto the train, as I said, I could my parents the same thing. They were so weak, and because that was January 45. And when we came onto the train, being normal carriages, so on each bunk, there was, they had been exchanged Polish people. They were lying one on each bench, and they wouldn't get up for us. We had to stand, we could hardly stand on our feet. They wouldn't get up, and they were just lying there, and we had to suffer and just stand until we got to the next stop.
Do you want to also mention about what your mother did vis-a-vis the crust of bread that day?
Oh, thank you. My father had an uncle who was in Bergen-Belsen, and whom we didn't see often, but how my mother even thought about it, she said when we were going to be released and to go out of Bergen-Belsen, she said to my father, just take the 3 crusts which we were given this morning and give them to Uncle. Either we won't need them anymore or it won't help us. But she thought straight away to whatever we had left to give to the uncle, because she was positive, thinking that hopefully it was going to be better for us where we were going to go.
And what happened to the uncle?
Oh, he didn't survive. He died in Bergen-Belsen.
Whilst my mother and her parents left in January 1945, the camp was liberated 3 months later in April by the British Army. The BBC's Richard Dimbleby was there and he saw the full horrors with his own eyes. In a now famous broadcast on the 19th of April 1945, he gave a detailed description, and this is just a little extract from what he said. 60,000 prisoners were found inside, most of them seriously ill. Another 13,000 corpses lay around the camp unburied. Here over an acre of ground lay dead and dying people. You could not see which was which. The living lay with their heads against the corpses, and around them moved the awful ghostly procession of emaciated, aimless people with nothing to do, with no hope of life, unable to move out of your way, unable to look at the terrible sights around them. This day at Belsen was the most horrible of my life. So what happened to the Canoreks after they left? Well, as my mother said before, they were placed on a Red Cross transport and they were taken to a hostel in Weingarten in Germany. At that stage, my mother weighed under 20 kilograms. Now, they arrived in Weingarten that night after a long journey. My mother has a very vivid recollection of what happened in Weingarten in one of the barracks there.
Well, it was a center where they were going to feed us. That was the first time we were actually going to even see some food again. And so we were sitting at long tables all together, and I with my parents and all the other people they knew, or not all of them. And when they were given some bowls, they were sending some bowls with some kind of vegetables or so through on and pushing through on the tables. There was one gentleman who was sitting on the other side of us, and he said to my father, just please push the other bowl through, because there is more over there. And he wouldn't give in, and only was satisfied when he got this bowl, put his arms around it and wouldn't give anything to anyone else, just held on to that. And unfortunately he overate and he died the next day because he just couldn't tolerate any more food.
A big problem immediately after liberation was that many prisoners who'd been starving for years were unable to tolerate any significant quantities of food. They'd been dreaming for years about being able to eat as much as they wanted, and once free, they found restraining themselves difficult when food was available. Ironically, so many ended up dying through overeating in the first days following liberation. In fact, a whole new branch of medicine appeared as a result of this, the science of nutrition in chronic starvation. Refeeding after starvation has to be done very carefully, and no one had identified this at the time. After a few days in the hostel, the Canoreks were taken by train to Biberach, a large internment camp on the German-Swiss border. Whilst the conditions in Biberach were considerably better than Bergen-Belsen, they were still grueling by any civilized standards. Now, what I've got in front in me is quite extraordinary as well. When they were in Biberach, so they arrived now in Biberach, and each person, each inmate was given one of these. This is a medical kit that they were handed out at that time. And it's extraordinary because, as you can see, this medical kit is in pristine condition. It's got bandages and it's got ointments, etc. And of course, the reason is that no ointment and no bandage was going to help any of the survivors from the camps. It was far, far more intense than what they'd gone through. So we have 3 of these, all in immaculate, pristine condition. Biberach was liberated by the French on the 23rd of April 1945. In the following card, which was written on the 23rd, at that particular time, we can see that Rosie is telling her parents about their liberation. And I'm just going to read you an excerpt from her note. So she's writing to her parents in Switzerland. Dearest parents, Mazel Tov, congratulations. Yesterday we were liberated from the Germans. You can hardly imagine how lucky this is for us. Please God, there should soon be peace in the whole world, and we will finally be able to meet again. Until now, it has not been too bad in this internment camp, and we have been so spoilt since the arrival of the French. It's difficult to describe, just heaven on earth. Many thousand kisses, Rosie and Zahava. And then, in June 1945, 6 weeks after their liberation, Zahava's grandparents in Zurich received a historic orange card celebrating Holland's liberation from Germany. And this is remarkable. Why? Because it's from Annie Rodenburg. Remember, she was the contact with the Dutch resistance. And this is what she says in this particular card to Zahava's grandparents. Dear Mrs. And it's the 7th of June, 1945. Dear Mrs. Gutmann, now I can write to tell you that your grandchild, Yehudi Kanarek, is in Holland, and he is well. We have heard that your daughter and her husband and their little girl are in Switzerland. Is it true? I had already feared the worst. They'll be very happy to hear something at last about the little boy. He has grown up okay. He no longer has a little girly face, but is now a real boy with short hair. He is in a children's home in Haarlem. I have not seen him for a year because travelling was not possible. He's very attached to the woman there and also to his little sisters. This year he went to kindergarten. I hope to hear from you soon. Many regards, yours truly, Mrs. Rodenburg. So this is extraordinary. It's June 1945, and we know at this stage, or they know, that the grandparents know that Yehudi is alive. Even though the war was over, there was chaos. The Kanareks were amongst thousands of displaced people who had been made destitute by the Germans. But fortunately, they had family in Zurich, who finally were able to arrange for them to travel there in the summer of 1945. The majority of displaced people who did not have family faced several years in internment camps following the war. And on the 23rd of July, my grandfather sent this telegram to Annie Rodenburg to find out about Yehudi. And you can see he just says, tell us about our son. We're very anxious to find out. And this is the response he got from Annie Rodenburg. The child is quite well. Remarkable. Zygmunt returned to Holland by himself in November 1945, when he was only temporarily reunited with Yehudi, who was now 4 years old. Zygmunt was intent on re-establishing himself by finding a place to live and making a living so he could support the family upon their eventual return. My mother and my grandmother were too weak to return to Amsterdam at this stage, and they remained in Switzerland, where they underwent intense medical treatment for severe malnutrition and other illnesses. That said, from time to time, my mother was able to attend school in Zurich. And where is it? I can't even see, but my mother's over there. While Zygmunt was in Amsterdam and Rosie and Zahava stayed in Zurich, Yehudi went to live with relatives in Sweden. At this stage, he had not seen his mother and sister since he was a 16-month-old toddler. He was now 4 years old. You might be wondering why the family remained apart for this additional time after the war. Well, much as my grandmother wanted nothing more for the family to be reunited, she knew that she was in no physical or emotional state to look after her children until she had further recovered from her ordeal. Once again, it was a very difficult decision for her to make, but at the time it seemed the right one for the Kanarek family. It was only in November 1946 that my mother and my grandmother finally returned to Amsterdam. That's nearly 20 months after the end of the war. And shortly after, they made the journey to Sweden, where they were finally reunited with Yehudi in Stockholm. So now I'm going to ask my mother to tell you about that period when they went back to Amsterdam first of all, and then that journey to Sweden and how it was like for her to be reunited with her brother, etc.
Well, first of all, I was also having quite a bit of medical treatment because to overcome all the problems we had had. And so I was back and forth all the time. I did go occasionally, as Hefti said, to school, but that was very irregular because I had to have all the time medical treatment. And my mother also. And also we had no more we were waiting for my father to get accommodation because everything had been taken from us at the time in Amsterdam. We had no furniture, we had nothing left. So he then started getting, first of all, he was employed then by a company who was dealing in rainwear, and just to make slowly a living again. And then we finally then went to join my father, and as Hephzibah said, then very soon after that, my parents made a decision that my mother and I should go to Stockholm to pick up my brother. And I have got actually quite a clear vision of that, because in those days I don't think in '46 many people would use airplanes, but we took a plane from Amsterdam to Stockholm, which meant Amsterdam to Copenhagen, and from Copenhagen we had to change on a plane to Stockholm. But when we were flying very low over the sea in landing to go in Copenhagen, I said in a very loud voice, and because, as I said, I wouldn't have known what flying had meant before in any case, and I said to my mother, can you imagine, we survived Bergen-Belsen and now we are going to drown in the sea, because the water was just underneath us, and it was something I just couldn't face. But then my mother had to tell me that it was going to be all right, and we were going to take another plane to go to Stockholm. And then my mother very quickly, because Yehudi was staying with a cousin of my mother's who had moved to Stockholm, and and he was used to her children. He thought these were his siblings. So now comes another woman. He had first had a mother in Holland, then he's got a mother in Stockholm. Now comes another one who calls herself his mother. So he got completely confused. He had no idea what was happening. He didn't want to hear about it. And so my mother every day organized outings for the three of us together to let him get used to have a sister, me, and herself as a mother. So every day she would try to get things organized for the three of us. And but then
he didn't want to go back with you at this stage, did he?
What?
He didn't want to go back.
No,
with you.
because he had, as I mentioned, he had a mother in Holland, now in Sweden, and he loved her, and he didn't want to hear about another mother. And so my mother, as I mentioned, tried every day to organize things for the three of us that he would get used to us. And my father had only met him very briefly when he handed him over to the people who were sending him to Stockholm. So, but I think by that time he probably wouldn't have recognized him anymore either. And so as he became very unhappy of hearing that we were going to take him with us, so my mother bought him a big balloon, and he was very happy with that. And on one of the outings, and the balloon became smaller, and so he was very unhappy about that. So my mother said, you know what, when we go back to Amsterdam, Daddy there will be able to re-inflate and make the balloon bigger again. After that, he didn't want to wait. He wanted to go the next day to Amsterdam. And, but we quite soon, my mother arranged that we would go back. And I remember, as I mentioned before, we had nothing left. We had no furniture or anything at all, because everything had been taken from us. She bought 2 wooden folding beds that we would have one bed for each other in Amsterdam, because you couldn't get anything yet in Holland either.
So after 6 weeks they were in Stockholm, they decided they could finally go back to Amsterdam. So how was it for them to rebuild their shattered lives? Well, they settled in Amsterdam, and my mother went back to school, and so did Yehudi. And here we have my mother back in school in 1947, and here she is, age 12. And what I find interesting about this particular photograph is that every single one of these children has either survived a camp or has been hidden. So you can imagine the stories that go on behind every single one of those children. And here we have a lovely picture of my mother and her brother, and those are the long plaques that she was talking about before. After completing school, my mother started working in Amsterdam for a company who dealt with the importation of leather hides. Given her father's continued frail health, She also helped him with his business in the evenings, and he was involved in the manufacturing of capes for the use of cyclists. My grandfather passed away in 1976. In 1958, in her early 20s, my mother decided to broaden her horizons and she moved to London. She began working as a nursery teacher at a kindergarten, but she continued to visit her parents regularly in Holland. And here we have a lovely family photograph in 1961. In August 1962, whilst visiting her parents on holiday at the seaside town of Scheveningen in Holland, my mother agreed to meet a dashing young pharmacologist, the son of people who they had met on their holiday. And this young gentleman, Ralph Kohn, became her husband within a year of their meeting. They married in Amsterdam in March 1963. So here we have the civil wedding of my parents, and then their actual wedding, and then remarkably Rosie and Zygmunt there. My parents have continued to live in London since they married, and they have 3 daughters and 5 grandchildren. I'm the eldest daughter. Together, my parents have led a full and stimulating life. They've created a strong, loving, and cohesive family, built a business, been hugely active supporters of countless charities, and been behind numerous exciting projects over the years for the arts, music, science, education, and humanitarian causes. In short, they've been incredible role models. So what happened to Yehudi? Yehudi studied languages at the university in Switzerland, and he then moved to Israel, where he joined the diplomatic service. During his career, he held posts in Germany, America, and Canada. And his final post was as Israeli ambassador to Belgium and Luxembourg. He is married with 2 children and 1 grandchild. He is now retired and lives in Israel and is in close touch with my mother. And here just to have a few family photographs. This was now nearly 2 years ago when my parents celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. Rosie lived in Holland until the age of 87 when she emigrated to Israel. Despite, or maybe because of her experiences, she was an exceptionally robust, strong-willed lady. She died at the age of 95. When we were growing up, my mother never spoke about her childhood experiences. But that all changed when, after my grandmother's death in 2001, my mother discovered this little suitcase containing the documents, some of which you've seen today. My mother started speaking about this part of her life, and it culminated in her writing her book, Fragments of a Lost Childhood, which I've been referring to. Her book was published in 2009 through the Holocaust Centre in Nottingham. And since then, my mother has been speaking to school children of all backgrounds throughout the United Kingdom and Germany. The response has been overwhelmingly positive and has further encouraged my mother to try to connect with as many people as possible so they should never forget. So why is this such a remarkable story? Well, apart from it being about my mother, I feel the story is about resilience, tenacity, recovery, and renewal. I think it's a compelling narrative as it demonstrates the human spirit overcoming evil. My mother and her family endured horrific circumstances, and they survived, and we are all humbled by their resolve and their determination. Whilst I believe that behind many stories of survival in the Holocaust lie a miracle of good luck and fortune, alongside this, in the case of my mother's family, I think it was all about attitude. The Kanarek family acted with courage, positivity, dignity, and strength. Instead of acting like victims, my mother and her family moved forward. They created new beginnings, and they embraced life with hope and determination. And that, to me, is the true inspiration. Thank you.